Hi, everyone. Welcome in. I'm just going to wait a couple minutes for other people to enter the waiting room and everything, and then we'll get started. So. All right, welcome everybody to our virtual talk today. If you could please keep yourselves muted throughout the entire talk until the end. We will have a time for questions and comments at the end when our speaker she'll be happy to address any of those. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. And you guys on Facebook Live can also ask questions using the comment section, and we will be monitoring those and answering those at the end of the program as well. Please do note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live, and it will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. So you can rewatch the talk or previous virtual talks on our YouTube or Facebook pages. And I am excited to introduce our speaker, Karen Halmerson, who is a docent with the Timken and giving a wonderful talk about Flemish art. So welcome, Karen, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Taylor. Yes, welcome everyone. I'm so glad you can join us for this talk on Flemish art in the 15th and 16th centuries. I do have a little bit of a disclaimer in that I have done this presentation not too long ago, a few months ago. And if you've seen that, I apologize. We did consolidate some of our lecture series. And so there was a bit of an overlap. But suffice to say, I think that this is such an important time period in art and such a wonderful collection of artists that I think you'll find it still very worthwhile. Right now, we're looking at one of our magnificent works in the Timken Museum. It's The Death of the Virgin by the great Petrus Christus. I'm not going to tell you too much about this painting at this time because we will look at it as we go through some of the other works. Right now, I just want to tell you a little bit about the general geography, the politics, the religion of this time period, and what artists to look at, and sort of just the qualities and characteristics. So during this time of the Low Countries, and that would be today Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and northern France, it was under the direction of the Valois French Burgundian court. So it was a Burgundian court. The Valois family was in charge, and they were really in charge of this region from about 1390 to about 1490, at which time, around that time, give or take a few years, the Spanish Habsburg Empire took over, and there was a beginning of a bifurcation. In 1517, Martin Luther nails his edict to the church door, 95 edicts, and he begins to try to break away from the Catholic Church. And that is why in the beginning of the 17th century, we actually have Holland and Belgium separating. Belgium retains its Catholic interests, and Holland is Protestant. Why that's important is because toward the end of the talk, you will begin to see artists like Pieter Bruegel, who actually paints both Catholic and Protestant themes. During this time, however, in the early part of the 15th century, beginning with the great works of Robert Campin, these are mostly Catholic images that we're going to be looking at. Most of the artists at this time created what we call panel paintings. They could be in diptychs, 2 panels, triptychs, 3 panels, or polyptychs, multi-panels, as you're going to see pretty soon. They also did some beautiful portraits. Now, who's funding all this? You know, Bruges and Ghent, where most of these paintings were created. There's some other cities involved, Tournai, for example, in Belgium, and Brussels. But most of these artists were working in Bruges, and Bruges was an important center for cloth manufacturing and trade. Because if you know something about Bruges, I've been very blessed to have visited that city. Bruges is on a series of canals that connect to the North Sea, which made this region great for trade. A lot of money was pouring into Bruges, and money from Italy, from families like the Medicis. They set up banks. And so when there's a lot of wealth, a lot of art is created. And so what kind of art besides the panels and the portraits? Lots of manuscript illumination, polychrome sculpture, and other books. And so another important thing to remember is the printing press is not invented till 1440. So a lot of the artists who you're going to look at, particularly in the early part of this discussion, actually train, as Jan van Eyck did, as manuscript illuminators. So we've got the region, which would be today Belgium, primarily, and we are looking at mostly the city of Bruges and Ghent. One other point I want to make before we start looking at the paintings is there is a little bit of crossover between the term Netherlandish and the term Flemish. And Christina Rosenberg, who is head of education at the Timken and an art historian, we've also often had discussions like, when do we use that term Netherlandish? When do you use the term Flemish? Many people see it as synonymous. I like to make a bit of a distinction, and I tend to use Flemish when I'm talking about painters that lived and worked in areas that are today Belgium. When I think about Pieter Bruegel, who you're going to see shortly, he was from the town of Breda, which is today Holland. I consider him more Netherlandish. I don't think it's incorrect to say either one, but I just wanted to show you that there is a bit of a difference. All right. The 3 great artists of this earlier part of the Flemish time period, Flemish Renaissance. Now you have to remember, there's the Italian Renaissance is occurring too. How are they different? The Italian Renaissance is more interested in humanism, and also they hearken back to the heritage of Greco-Roman art. That is not true for the Flemish Netherlandish painters. They are still more connected to their Gothic roots. Also, we have more of an interest in realism, sources of light, and religious iconography. So even though they're occurring at the same time, and there's cross-pollination from Flanders to Florence, for example, there is a slight difference. Now, let's begin with one of the paintings. It is an altarpiece, the Murad altarpiece, and it was made for a particular family. Many times the altarpieces could be made for a wealthy family, and sometimes they're made for a placement in a church or a cloister, a monastery, but this one happens to be was created for a family. So Robert Campin, sometimes called the Master of Flamel, Jan van Eyck, and Roger van der Weyden are the triumvirate, the 3 really great painters of this time. So we'll begin with Robert Campin. Robert Campin was from the town of Tournai in Belgium. The Valois dukes primarily lived in Brussels at this time, but they went a lot to Ghent and Bruges. So that's where most of these artists are located. Robert Campin here has painted the Annunciation, a beautiful triptych. You can see that they're panels and they would be closed. Oftentimes they use Baltic wood, and it wasn't really until the 16th century in Venice that we begin to see a lot of artwork on canvas. So primarily we're going to see, if not all, paintings on wood. So this is the Annunciation. angel Gabriel comes to the Virgin Mary and tells her she will carry the Christ child. On the right panel is her betrothed, Joseph. On the left panel, we have the donors, the Murad family, who have commissioned this painting. So we'll concentrate on the central panel, which is the most important, and then we'll talk a little bit about the accompanying panels. This is a crowded space. It is not a sacred space. It is a space of a middle-class Flemish family. And we see a fireplace, we see a dining table and some chairs or benches, and we see windows that open up to the landscape. These artists were very interested in realism, minute detail. You can see that everything from, and I'm going to hope that you can see my cursor, but here's the Holy Ghost flying on a beam of light. And these tondo or ocular windows are here. We have a fountain sort of form, and that's, fountain of water and life. We have a beautiful cloud formation here. And then we have the Murad family crests. We have a book of hours, a book of prayers and calendars that were very popular among the wealthier set and the churches. They were handmade. Remember, if you look at the date, painting was done before the advent of the printing press by Gutenberg in 1440. We have beads. We have Mary in a red robe. Red and blue are her colors. And she seems to sit almost like in a humility pose on the ground. And we have this beautiful detailed ceiling. But the angel Gabriel kneels in a very pleasant but sacred way, even though this is not a sacred space. And then we have these three lilies. The three lilies, often white lily relates to the purity of Mary, but here it relates to the Holy Trinity. Now let's look at the outside. Here we have the donors kneeling in the outside of this space with a beautifully detailed garden gate. And then we have a fortress wall with actually someone standing guard, and then rose bushes. And usually rose bushes can signify anything for love or the passion. And then we're going to quickly look, because I tend to go over and we have so many paintings to talk about, so I will move on in a minute. This is Joseph. And it was said in the writings of St. Augustine that mousetraps refer to crosses, and he's creating mousetraps. And mousetraps were said, / crosses were said to be the work of the devil. And you might think, well, crosses in Christianity? No, but you have to remember also the crosses were the crucifixion. And here we have the city of Bruges, I believe, with red bricked roofs, very beautifully detailed. And we have also a mousetrap. So this is one of the earliest Renaissance paintings of the North. And Robert Campin, or the Master from All, he was really the segue between the Middle Ages or the Gothic and the Northern Renaissance. All right, we'll go to the next painting. One of my favorite paintings in all of art history is this, the Virgin of Chancellor Roland. And I apologize because in this particular image, it is not colored, the color is not vibrant as it is in the painting at the Louvre, but suffice to say the details and the forms are remarkable. So Jan van Eyck was considered one of the great geniuses of the early Renaissance. And he was often said to be the originator of oil painting. That is not quite correct. Robert Campin and Jan van Eyck actually created better use and better techniques for the use of oil painting. Artists are beginning to abandon tempera and move into oil painting because oil painting is so rich. Jan van Eyck had a brother we'll talk about shortly, and he had another brother who Hubert we'll talk about, and then he had another brother who was a famous manuscript illuminator of Van Eyck, and as was Jan van Eyck. And you can see that he is so interested in minute detail, in the use of light, rich color, and also a lot of religious iconography. And iconography, as you recall, is a symbolism in painting. And of course, most of it is religious. So let's talk about this magnificent painting. What we have here is Chancellor Roland, and he commissioned this painting, and he was in the city of Autun, or Autun, A-U-T-U-N, in France. And remember, this was a Burgundian court still. So they're in charge. And Chancellor Roland was a very, very wealthy man. In fact, in this magnificent landscape, through this portico, you will see that there is cathedrals and bridges and houses and towers. And he was kind of in charge of all that. And he also made money partially owning vineyards. And you actually can see some of the vineyards in this hazy, beautiful landscape of the city of Bruges. Because Jan van Eyck really lived in Ghent. And then when he was awarded a lot of commissions, he came to the city of Bruges. And later he was so popular among the aristocrats and upper classes, the Italians. He ventured as far as Portugal and Italy, very famous, one of the most famous artists of his time, and of course, and now as well. So Chancellor Roland is in a sacred space. He holds his hands in prayer. He doesn't even look directly at the Virgin Mary because it's too sacred. And she is on a throne, and they're at eye level, which is kind of remarkable. In medieval times, you would not have seen that. You would not have seen a human in the sacred space of a religious figure, but here we do have that. She is crowned Queen of Heaven by this angel with exquisite, highly detailed wings. We actually have magnificent stained glass. You know, the Romans invented the use of glass. And we also have the Christ child on her lap, and he holds a crystal orb. And this is an orb with a cross, and that is what is called Salvator Mundi, Savior of the world. And he holds his fingers in benediction to the chancellor, who has a book of hours. Again, I remember these are handmade books. The book of hours would have prayers and calendars, and very important. And then we have this magnificent landscape. It was said that the man on the right has a red chapeau, red hat, could actually be a little portrait of Jan van Eyck, the painter, and then accompanying individual. He looks at, as I say, this magnificent kind of hazy landscape, and look at the beautiful cathedral here, or palace. And then we have some birds and flowers. These flowers relate to the attributes of the Virgin. For example, white lilies, purity, her sorrows, their irises and peonies, and all kinds of beautiful flowers that relate to her purity and also her sacrifices. Now, two more things I want to point out. There is a magpie bird you can see here in the lower left of the middle ground of the painting, and a peacock. What is their symbolism? Remember, lots of iconography. The peacock was a symbol of Jesus and also of immortality. The magpie, an evil kind of like blustering and overconfidence, is kind of an evil trait. So what Jan van Eyck incorporates is good and evil. So lastly, we have this beautiful Romanesque, which precedes Gothic. So it's a little earlier, beginning in the 9th century. So we have what is called Romanesque architecture. It's more rounded, not high and pointed. And we have these interesting capitals. They're a combination of Doric, flat, I beg your pardon, and Corinthian, carved, and Ionic, scrolled. So they're kind of a composite. So we have a lot of beautiful paintings to talk about. So I'm going to move on. And this is one of the most important paintings of the Northern Renaissance. And this is the marriage portrait of Arnolfini. It has several names, but we'll go with the Arnolfini portrait, and it is now in the National Gallery. What we see here is just a cornucopia of beauty, detail, skill, and iconography. So was said to be the marriage portrait of a wealthy Florentine merchant, Arnolfini. As I told you, many of the high-born Italians came to Bruges, where this painting was created, because there was this wonderful cloth trade and cloth economy, and there was a lot of money. So they came sometimes as bankers or tradesmen. So Arnolfini was Italian, and he came to have his painting done, was living in Bruges, and he decided to have one of the most important artists of that time, Jan van Eyck, to paint his portrait. But there's something kind of odd about this painting. We know that the woman in this painting actually was dead by this time. Wow, that's a little macabre. It was. I mean, they are actually married in 1426. So it is never quite explained why the painting was done several years after her death. But suffice to say, it could be an homage to her. So Arnolfini is shown in beautifully embellished clothing. This is a highly detailed robes with ermine, beautiful fur. And if you look very closely, the hat, tightly woven straw, took a master hat maker to make this. And then his wife is in an exquisite green, beautifully detailed gown. When first looking at this painting, you might say, well, is she pregnant? No, she was not. She was not pregnant. Actually, it's just a lot of cloth that would have been draped on the floor, and a servant, because of their high status, would probably have to hold the cloth. We have a lot of other things. This is the bedroom, not a sitting room. It's a bedroom because we see a red canopy bed. We also have a couple interesting elements in this highly detailed painting. And again, I mentioned that he loved realism, he loved detail, and he loved light. And so we begin to see the light as it falls on the face of Arnolfini. And to think about light, I know that a lot of people say, oh, it was Leonardo da Vinci in, this early part of the 16th century really begins to show light in painting, or Caravaggio in the early part of the 17th century. But that isn't exactly true. The Northern artists were very interested in light sources. And so they began to often paint light in their great works. So we have a little dog. What does that represent? Well, dogs had a couple representations. In upper class homes, you would often have lap dogs, but it also relates to the idea of fidelity. I'm older, so I remember as a kid, Fido, Spot. Well, Fido comes from the word fidelity. Now that's such an obsolete term, you wouldn't even hear about it. A couple other things to point out. We have a pair of clogs. The clogs were used in this time period in the early part of the 15th century because dirt bringing in was unsacred. This is not, they don't want dirt in a sacred space or a bedroom space. So that would be why the clogs are there. Then we have oranges. Oranges have a couple of representations. Oranges relate to fecundity, or to be fertile, to bear children, and also shows their wealth because, oranges aren't grown so much in the Low Countries. They're grown in places like Spain and Portugal, North Africa. So they had to come from a different place. Here in the window on the left, we have rose bushes, and that relates to love because this is a couple, beautiful light source. And then we have this stained glass window, and then we have a chandelier with one candle, and that represents the presence of God. Now, the mirror. Wow, the mirror. Okay, so if you fast forward and go to the 17th century in the 1600s, and if you know the painting by the great Velázquez, he painted Las Meninas. And in Las Meninas is a convex mirror that highlights witnesses to the court of the Habsburgs, and that's with Las Meninas. Here we have a mirror, and it shows, if you look closely, to two witnesses who might have been in the entrance of this bedroom. And also we see that it could have even been Jan van Eyck, because we have him signing in a very unusual script here. And then we have, if we move a little bit over to the right, we have a brush, and we have beads, and we have the finial carved with the face or the body of Saint Margaret. And Saint Margaret was the patron saint of childbirth. Around the mirror are some of the passions of Christ. So there's a lot of religious nature, but there's also this beauty of the detailing. Again, he was a manuscript illuminator, everything from the little bracelets. Now, it is some people, when I read about it, said, oh, this is uber rich family. It really wasn't, however. These are upper bourgeois, not quite aristocrats. We know this because of the absence of ornate jewelry. Also, the space is a little bit smaller, but they were very wealthy people. Last thing I want to say is that in holding her hand, it's a little unusual because normally he would be holding her other hand, because this might indicate that she was of a lower status, but that isn't true either. Her father was a very wealthy banker, and so she came also from an upper class family. So the marriage portrait of Arnolfini shows the gift, the beauty, the resonance of the colors that Jan van Eyck employed, the light sources, the detail, a magnificent portrait. Now, perhaps the greatest altarpiece ever done in the North was this magnificent, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. I took a pilgrimage to Bruges the first time I saw this, and I was transfixed. Probably spent 3 hours staring at this magnificent altarpiece. I'm going to show you that it was actually 12 panels. This is the most important panel. It was the namesake of the altarpiece. And it is today in St. Bavo's Cathedral in the city of Ghent. At the time that Hubert and Jan van Eyck painted this, they were living in Ghent. And subsequently, Jan van Eyck was brought to Bruges, where he set up workshops. He was part of the Guild of St. Luke, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But there's another name here, Hubert. So there's a lot of mystery in how much Hubert painted this altarpiece. Some people thought he started the altarpiece and then Jan van Eyck finished it. Others say he really just did most of the framing and just a little bit of the detail. Most people would probably say we can attribute this primarily to Jan van Eyck. Now, I apologize for doing this, but I think it's important. I neglected to have a slide of the entire altarpiece. So I'm going to in a rather unelegant way, I'm just going to show you the 12 panels. And you can see that it's a polyptych, 12 panels, and the center, the top panel is God the Father. You have both Adam and Eve, and angels and people on horseback. Now, when this panel is closed, it is highly painted on the outside with grisaille, which is gray painting. But let's talk about the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. So remarkable in its beauty and detail. Look at the hyper detailing of the flowers, the faces. And in the center, we have a fountain of life, water of life. And then on a platform, we have the sacred lamb who represents Jesus. Now, if you get a chance to go to the Museum of Art in San Diego Museum of Art, they have a beautiful Zurbaran painting of Agnus Dei, sacred lamb of Jesus, and he represents Jesus. That's just one lamb. Here it is put in a very detailed landscape. So you see blood coming out of the lamb. That is sacred blood. That is his crucifixion and sacrifice. And what this entire central panel is about is the redemption of mankind. That really is the representation of this panel and the sacrifice Jesus made. Also, what do we have here? Oh, we have apostles and saints and martyrs. And we have the higher ups of the Catholic Church in their red robes and crowns. And we have martyrs and musicians, because if you see the angels have musical instruments, and if you look at other portions of the panel outside of this central panel, you will also see lots of musicians heralding Jesus. In the background here, we have the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, and then you can't really see it on the slide, but above that is the figure of God as kind of pantocrator, overlooking, omnipresent. And then, of course, this magnificent Flemish city with castles and churches and towers, all kinds of detail, and then palm trees and sources of light, sources of fauna and flora. Well, not just the lamb, but the flowers, the sacred lily of Mary. And so this is a very, very religious painting. And his work was so prominent that people actually, even in the 15th century, came to be in the presence of this magnificent altarpiece. And of course, Jan van Eyck was so accomplished that not only did he train artists like Paetus Christus, who we're going to look, but he was also famous in other parts of Europe. I'm going to move on just because we have so much to talk about. So Roger van der Weyden, who was born in, I believe, Tournai, which is part of Belgium today, and he worked in Brussels and I believe somewhat in Bruges. Now, this painting was commissioned, Descent from the Cross, to be placed. It was commissioned by a guild, but it was also meant to travel to another space in Europe. And it is originally, eventually it ends up in the Prado. But let's just talk about Descent from the Cross. This, again, is one of the most important altarpieces in Northern European art, and it was the central panel. There were accompanying panels to the triptych. They are lost. Now, actually, before this was taken to Spain, we had the crossbow guild, the guild of people who made these crossbows, and you can actually see the crossbows here. And you see a very interesting configuration. It's kind of a closet space. It's very confined. It is not what you would consider a typical sacred space, but could almost look like a tomb. And then we have 9 important figures. Roger van der Weyden studied with Robert Campin, and he was one of the great artists of this time period. Now, who do we have here? Obviously, we have Jesus as his descent from the cross, and he is in an S curve as he falls to the ground. But he's, I beg your pardon, as he falls to the ground, and his curvilinear form is mirrored by his mother's, and they're in abject grief. This is a tender but very emotional image, the central panel. The other thing I want to mention is there's a lot of action in the panel. There's a lot of movement that's indicated. So who else? We have St. John here, and he is holding Mary, and on his right, as a companion forms, is Mary Magdalene. And she is repented, and she has come to be in this sacred space, and she is in an S curve as well. So their bodies hold the painting together. And here we have Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. We have a man holding a jar of ointment who is not named, and then a worker helping to take him down from the cross and holding a handful of nails. And these 2 other forms are Mary Salome and Mary Cleopas. And Mary Cleopas was the half-sister of Mary of Mary. And she is seen weeping. You can actually see tears down her face. You can see even the stubble of beard on Nicodemus. So hyper detailed, beautifully rendered. And a couple other things I want to point out in this painting. We have Golgotha and the skull of Adam and the thigh bone, and then these exquisite plants that are at the feet of these mourners. So Roger van der Weyden, Jan van Eyck, Robert Campin, consider the triumphant of great painters of the North. Roger van der Weyden also did this well, he was a prolific artist, and this is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. There's another version, I believe, in the National Gallery in London, but this is the most important version. So let's talk about this. St. Luke drawing the Virgin. St. Luke, who is featured here, was the patron saint of painters, and he was also the patron saint of medical doctors. So he has two important roles. It was said about the 8th or 9th century, I've seen it 8th century, I've seen it 9th century, that people began to talk about how do we capture the beauty of Mary. And so this is kind of what Roger van der Weyden harkens to. How do we capture the beauty of Mary? And he captures this in this beautiful space. And she has idealized beauty, but also kind of natural beauty. And you see she is breastfeeding the infant Jesus. And what is shown here is actually a little bit of milk as it emerges from her breast. That depiction was not viewed too favorably subsequently. You don't see too many versions of the breastfeeding with the breast so exposed. I mean, you still will see it, but this was a little bit not frowned upon, but kind of changed. So we have St. Luke, and some people would say that this is actually a portrait of van der Weyden himself. And he holds a stylus, a writing implement, and he holds it at a right angle. It's kind of interesting, and he's trying to capture her essence. And Roger van der Weyden creates this amazing detail. He's kneeling on the floor. And then we see these Corinthian capitals. And this is, again, a Romanesque interior, lower, more rounded, even though this looks square, but it is considered more rounded. We have an oculus here, a window, and we have a magnificent canopy. I beg your pardon. I bear with me. Sometimes I have a little problem with that. And there's some carvings. Now, it's very hard for me to see, but this is actually Adam and Eve with the serpent. That's on the finial of this chair. This is kind of a chair. And also we have here a bull, a head of a bull. And why do we have a head of a bull? It represents St. Luke. That was an attribute associated with St. Luke. And then we have these two figures. Well, who could they be? Well, it is said that they are the parents of Mary. And so Joaquin and Elizabeth. So they're out here looking over this crenellation, a cut in the wall, and they're looking out on a river of a Flemish city. We have a castle and all kinds of trees and waterways, and then this beautiful garden. And again, often these flowers would represent attributes of Mary. Now, I always have a tendency in the beginning to just go to detail by detail, so I'm going to have to move on. I could talk about this painting for an hour, but here's a sacred book. This is just before the advent of the printing press, and we have, again, the beautiful light source. Now, we are very blessed at the Timken Museum to have a Pages Christus. Christus, who was a disciple of Jan van Eyck. Some people say he studied in his workshop. Others would say he just was very aware of Jan van Eyck. I have a feeling that he did study with him, but we have a beautiful Pages Christus. I'm going to show it to you momentarily, but this one is really remarkable. It is in the Met, and it is a goldsmith in his shop. And Pages Christus, working primarily in Bruges, creates a painting of someone who probably did live at this time. Now, some people originally thought this goldsmith was painted as the patron saint of goldsmith, and it was more of a religious figure. And subsequently, that was disputed. And we think that this goldsmith did live, and it is a portrait, but he's unnamed. Now we have a couple, an affluent couple, probably Italian, coming in to have a marriage ring made. We have a belt here in the foreground, and that is a belt of marriage. We have her hand outstretched. Now, if you look at, there's some interesting detail on the faces of these upper class people, but really our focus is on the goldsmith. And he kind of looks to our left, and he's a little more detailed, not his clothing, but his facial characteristics. What are all these magnificent, beautifully captured elements? All right, so here we have him weighing the gold, and we have coins, and that indicates that goldsmiths often were not only making jewelry, but handling gold. And then we have rings, and we have brooches, and we have loose stones, and gems, rings, some more loose stones. And then we have these beautiful brooches, and we have pewter containers, and these would be used to put money or alms for the city of Bruges. And then we have coral and some beading, and these represent, and shark's teeth. Well, what are shark's teeth there for? Shark's teeth were used to indicate if poison was present. People used to think that if you put shark's teeth in, let's say, a beverage, you would know if it was poison because the shark's teeth would turn color. But the gems relate not only to creating jewelry, but the medicinal qualities of gems. And then lastly, I want to talk about really quickly this beautiful, again, this convex mirror, and we see two figures holding a falcon. Now, a falcon was used among the upper classes. Falconeering was popular, but it also relates to a little bit of hubris, and that, you know, we're kind of high and mighty, and we hold this bird. And so what Petrus Christus was probably indicating is that the outside world can be daunting and even evil, and the inside world is more sacred. And even though this is not a sacred painting, but more sacred and kind. So the difference. We're going to go to our very own Petrus Christus, The Death of the Virgin. This is a magnificent central panel, and two of the panels that accompanied it were destroyed during World War II. And one thing I forgot to mention is the the Ghent altarpiece actually at 4 different times was almost destroyed during World War II. Prior to that, during the Protestant Reformation. So there's a lot, that painting, that altarpiece really overcame a lot of adversity. So here we have the Death of the Virgin in our very own Timken, and it's very large. I hope you come to visit it. And it shows 3 events in the life of the Virgin Mary, or 3 episodes really. And it was not from the Bible. It actually comes from apocryphal literature, stories told during that time. And we have people entering the sacred space where Mary lies on her deathbed. And of course, the red bed, and she holds a candle of her spirituality and of her life force. And she is dying, and her spirit is ascending to heaven. So here's little vignette 1, the death of Mary. Her spirit is ascending from candlelight to her body, and God is hovering sort of to capture that spirit. Now, if you go to the diagonal, you have an amazing window and landscape, and outside in this landscape, you have Doubting Thomas. And Doubting Thomas was looking up and saying, you know, I don't really think Mary is dead. And the angel says, I'm sorry, it is true. And I can prove it to you because here is her belt. So the Doubting Thomas. We have a chair with a book of hours or a prayer book. We have a highly detailed floor. And then we have worshipers holding reliquaries. And, you know, some people say these forms are a little bit rudimentary in terms of the facial characteristics and the thin bodies. Let me tell you that Petrus Christus was a brilliant, and you saw that with the previous painting, a brilliant portrait painter. But here he's talking about more of the spiritual aspects of the sacred world. I'm going to go on because I really think that the Portinari altarpiece is really something that we need to talk about. Hugo van der Goes. Now, Hugo van der Goes was kind of a tragic figure because he was so obsessed with creating perfect paintings and hyper details that he actually died kind of mad. I mean, he died young. I think he was 41, and he died in a monastery because he just kind of went mad. But the Portinari altarpiece is also a very important altarpiece, and it was commissioned by the Portinari family, an Italian family, and it shows the adoration of the shepherds. And so let's talk a little bit about the painting. I just want to mention that it's very common in Netherlandish painting and Flemish painting to have the donors outside. And so we actually have the donors who commissioned this altarpiece with their patron saints. So we have the Portinari family members, and then we have Saint Anthony, Saint Anthony with a bell. And then, and he's on the left holding a bell. And then we have Anthony with the bell and with the sphere. It escapes me. So if you just let me think about it for just a second. But we'll move on because we don't want to wait too long. Now, here is Margaret and Mary Magdalene, and Margaret has the Bible and dragon that are her attributes, and then Mary here with a jar of ointment. And then we have the women donors. Now, what you see is kind of an elevated status, that the sacred figures are a little bit larger than the angels. But what's so unusual about Hugo van der Goes's images here is that we have these shepherds, and they're the same size as the Virgin Mary and Joseph here with the cattle. And that's kind of remarkable. And also what's very remarkable in this painting and very unusual is that there's such, let's say, kind of rough figures. They're shown kind of antithesis of the more decorated and highly embellished dress and clothes of these patrons and also their religious patrons. Then we have a whole, like a village here with all the trees. We have angels, we have the cattle here, and we have everyone in prayer. And then we have these magnificent still life. If you look at the history of still life, you can say this is one of the most interesting altarpieces for the adding of still life. And one thing I needed to mention is having the infant Jesus encapsulated by light, but he's on the ground, and that's a little bit unusual. But look at these still lifes. And I just want to mention that the columbine relates to the sorrows, the seven sorrows of Mary, her purity, the red, her blood, the blood of Christ, I should say. And then we have the wheat as the Eucharist. So this is a highly religious altarpiece commissioned by the Portinari family. I am going to go on. We have a lot to talk about. One more Monforte altarpiece. This is the central panel. The other accompanying panels are missing. And this was meant to be taken to Spain, for sure. It was meant to be in a church in Spain. It was commissioned by Hugo van der Goes. Hugo van der Goes receives a commission. It's really beautiful. You have the sacred family in a palace. This is the ruins of a palace, and you can see horses and figures and animals here. And then we have three men looking into the scene. Remarkably, this man with a beard, we think was Hugo van der Goes. So that was a self-portrait. And then we have the three wise men, and we have Joseph with his hands open like, oh my God, Casper, he's the older gentleman in prayer before Mary. And look at the jewels, and well, not jewels exactly, the coins that you have brought. So Casper represents not only one of the wise men, but he represents the ages of man. He represents the older ages of man, and also, if I'm not mistaken, the Europe, the continent of Europe. And then we have Melchior, who represents the continent of Asia. And he is also representing Middle Age. And then we have Balthasar, who represents the continent of Africa. And he holds these beautiful reliquaries, and we see swords, and of course, the offerings. And then we see people in this sacred space who are probably present day individuals, maybe servants. And as I said, we have the artist himself, and then of course, magnificent irises. And then we also have a little niche, a still life, and then bread, of course, the bread of the Eucharist, and the irises, the 7 sorrows of Mary. So I'm going to move on because we do have a few more paintings I would really like to talk about. Gerard David, really, so this is for a family that, a French family that commissioned this. And you see their name there on the title. And this is the baptismal of Christ. And as you recall, it takes place in Jordan, and he is being baptized here. And an angel holds his clothing while this baptismal takes place, John the Baptist. We have also, I believe, St. Margaret here, and then the donors, the French family that donated this to the church in Spain. And of course, this very mystical landscape, it's very static. When you looked at the descent from the cross, you see movement implied. This is hyper still. And Gerard David also incorporates, as many of these artists do, light sources. We have the Holy Spirit, and then of course, God overseeing all of this. And then townspeople, and then incredible detail. Look at the leaves as they wrap around the trunk of the trees, the viewers, the still water. So this is a very still and beautiful triptych. Now, Gerard David also paints this Madonna and Child with milk soup. And as you know, this is later. This is the time of after the Protestant Reformation, and we begin to have what's called the Counter-Reformation, where Catholic artists are encouraged to paint images of the Catholic Church and kind of avoid Protestant themes. But this is the very early part of the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is also the time when we're beginning to see the end of the Northern Renaissance and starting to go into what is called Mannerism, but we're still in the Renaissance. This is a little bit later. And at this time, the Habsburgs were in control. And as I mentioned, the Valois French are no longer overseeing everything. So this is such a sweet painting. The light is kind of diffused, and we see the baby Jesus, instead of being nursed by his mother, he holds a spoon, he's eating his gruel, as it were. And then we have the bread of the Eucharist here, a little still life, and Mary holds him in such contemplative way. And it is meant to be like the nurturing mother nurtures the brethren of the church. So that is a bit of a story behind it. And then of course, this open window and a beautiful city. And I believe he was working, if I'm not mistaken, in Brussels. Now, Jan Gossart was from, I believe, Brussels, but he was known to be a very accomplished portrait painter. And I wanted to show you this because I mentioned earlier that portraits were popular too, mostly religious paintings. We don't see a lot of historical paintings. Still life, of course, wasn't really present, or landscape that was incorporated, but not independent. So this is probably done when he was, young part of his career. He was a successful artist. You can tell by the embellishments on his hat. There's some gemstones and brooches. You can see how beautifully he details the beard, his eyes. There's a skull cap underneath, and then this exquisite collar of his clothing, and then the hands. And you've heard my lectures. If you have, you know that we often talk about how hands are the most difficult part of the human body to depict, and faces. So he's a very skilled, and he was known to do a lot of portraits. Just quickly, I just wanted to show you how detailed this painting is. This was a little different. This is more diffused. And he had gone to Rome, this artist had gone to Rome, and he had seen the work of Michelangelo. Well, how do we know that? Because in 1515, Michelangelo completes the David that's in Rome. And David, who's the so important to the Jewish tradition, was shown here with the 10 Commandments, but he has horns. An unfortunate translation, instead of light sources, it was translated from Hebrew into horns, and that's an unfortunate depiction, but he did see it in Rome. And he paints the Virgin Mary, St. Luke painting the Virgin Mary, but she is the Queen of Heaven in this very Italianate sphere. And you see this bas relief here, and it's a very Italianate interior. So she is shown with, as a being crowned, if you recall, the St. Luke. And if I get a moment, I will go back and show you, but this is very Italianate as opposed to Northern Renaissance. Now, I had to show you two more paintings really quickly. I might go over a couple minutes, I apologize. But this Adrian Eisenbrat, oh my gosh, talk about the ability to paint the human body. This is, to me, just incredibly beautiful. And it was done instead of Pontius Pilate calling for the crucifixion of Jesus and having people witnessing it. It is just the sacred space of Jesus mourning and his mother mourning this horrible, tragic proclamation. And you can see how Eisenbrat shows the stigmata here, and he's tied, and his tears of sorrow, and his crown of thorns, and his mother in almost shock and dismay. And then this amazing light-filled landscape, and this very gorgeous kind of gold bas relief capitals and colonnades. And it's really unfortunate because the beauty of the architecture and the landscape does not really tell us how tragic this event is. I'm going to have to move on. I apologize. So Pieter Bruegel the Elder is one of the greatest Northern Renaissance painters. He had a dynasty of artists, Velvet Bruegel, who was a still life painter, Pieter Bruegel the Younger, who was a landscape and genre painter. Pieter Bruegel was born in Breda, which is in Holland. And so I would use the term Netherlandish to describe him, but this is Parable of the Sower. And it is one of the most magnificent paintings in the Timken. Look at the color as it resonates. It's even more beautiful in real life. But what's so unusual, he paints a parable of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And the parable is, what you sow, you shall reap. So here we have a farmer sowing seeds in order to get crops. Pardon me. And in the background, we see Jesus proselytizing to gain converts. And then, of course, this alpine landscape and beautiful homes and churches and birds. What is remarkable about this painting is the use of color, rich, resonant color, but also, why do we have the Alps? Isn't this the Low Countries? You know, Holland and Belgium are below sea level in some areas. Pieter Bruegel was so famous that he actually went to Italy and Switzerland, saw the Alps, and he came back and said, you know, I kind of want to put them in the painting, artistic license. So that's why we have the Alps here. And I see we have one more minute, and I know I went over for my questions, but I just wanted to show you really quickly. I don't think I'll have time to talk about the Tower of Babel. So I will go on to the last image, and this is in our Timken. It's one of our newest acquisitions. And this is the Virgin of Sorrows. It was a Flemish family, well, perhaps actually Spanish. I apologize. Peter Clausen was Flemish, but this is a Spanish family, and you can see them on the donor panels of this triptych. And in the center, we have the Virgin of Sorrows. And the Virgin of Sorrows, represented by swords, represent her trials and tribulations. And so I'm going to close there. I do hope you come to the Timken and see our Pages Christus, our Pieter Bruegel, and Pieter Clausen, along with other masterpieces. And I do apologize for going over. I'm very happy to take questions. And so perhaps Taylor can let us know if we do have any questions. Hi.
Hi, so we do have one question, I believe it's from Facebook Live, and it is, do you think that the right side of the diptych with the marode altarpiece, the Joseph's Workshop one on the side, is depicting a level of the home, which is at a higher floor, whilst the central scene is at a ground level?
Oh, you know, I think it'd be worth going back to look at that. Let's do that really quickly.
And then we have another comment.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was it the marode altarpiece? Hold on. We just, oh my goodness. I'm going to take too much time. So when he's in his workshop, let me see if we can find it. Hold on. No, I apologize. I'm not going to be able to do that. I'll have to go back. So the question again was, I'm sorry, was the lower level where Joseph is creating the mousetraps, that was kind of at a lower level? Was the question, why was it at the lower level? I'm not quite, I guess I need to repeat it. I apologize. Repeat the question.
It says, do you think that the right side, Joseph's Workshop, is depicting a level of the home which is at a higher floor, while the central scene is at a ground level? And then we had another comment that says workshops always were on the ground floor coming out on the street.
Yes, really, really good point. And you have to, yes, the workshop, because you see absolutely lower, and that was really smart, the workshops, because many times people lived above as they do today. And also, you know, there is this thing about the creating of the mousetraps that is sort of warding off evil. And so that also factors in, and you can see too that perspective is still being grappled with. And a very important point I forgot to make, that when we look at the work of Pages Christus, we have to, and we're going to see that in this painting, he invents really single point perspective. And so Pages Christus 30 years later actually gives us more understanding of perspective. Robert Campin, master of Flamel, he is really the segue between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And so his use of perspective is not quite as developed. But so the answer is twofold. It's the perspective, understanding of perspective, and also what one of the viewers just said, it's the workshop was lower. And that's a really, really good point, because as you said, the street level right here, you can see the street level here. And here, the stairs, a little bit ascending to go into the home. So really good point. Excellent point. Are there any other questions?
Unless somebody would like to unmute themselves, but they can ask a question. But we do have another question about viewing previous free lectures. You can feel free to go to the Timken's YouTube page or Facebook page to watch the previous lectures. And then if anybody has any other questions, feel free to unmute or put them in the chat box. If not, I would like to say thank you so much to Karen for this wonderful lecture today. And then we will see you next week for another wonderful lecture.
Thank you, Taylor. And also thank you, viewers, for tuning in. I always appreciate it. I hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.